Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about probably one of the most iconic figures that is associated with All Hallows Eve, the vampire.
Now, that being said, the origins of the vampire are very, very tough to pinpoint. Some of them range back to like 4000 BC in like Mesopotamia. But there's definitely a turning point between ancient folklore, the modern ideology of what a vampire is and isn't. So, here we go. The image of a seductive night walkers we think of today was majorly shaped by pop culture dating back to the 1800s. But seeds of the modern concept have appeared in mythologies since the beginning of recorded history. First, or one of the first stories, is the story of a Egyptian feline warrior goddess associated with both plague and healing, is considered by some to be one of the oldest vampire tales. Legend holds that the sun god Ra sent his daughter Skemet, nailed that, down to punish humankind for their disobedience. But after she couldn't stop drinking blood amid her slaughter, Ra quelled her planet-draining thirst by dyeing a bunch of beer red. Basically, like, he dyed a bunch of beer red, and she got really, really drunk and passed out. Lilith, who is a 4,000-year-old figure from Jewish folklore in some stories, was Adam's wife before Eve, which is a whole nother conversation that we'll touch on somewhere else, right? She had a monstrous reputation in ancient Babylonia. The Babylonians believed that Lilith were hungry for victims because they had once been human and slipped through the windows into people's houses looking for victims to take place of husbands and wives whom they themselves have never had. While the image of Lilith as a deadly hungry temptress has endured for centuries, a subsection of self-identified feminists have embraced her as the first misunderstood feisty lady. Many cultures have some equivalent to the life-draining creature. In the Philippines, for example, there's a Manananggal. I don't know. Who some believe can shapeshift into women and suck blood from the bellies of the pregnant woman, and also hate garlic. But really, in the Middle Ages, variations of early vampire mythology proliferated across Europe, with the nefarious monsters often used to explain plagues and other diseases. Cases of rare blood disorders called porphyria in Eastern Europe may be the root of certain physical characteristics attributed with vampires. The symptoms include sunlight sensitivity. Physically, you would get blisters and burns when you're exposed to direct sunlight. Hallucination, the receding of gums, is given the impression of elongated teeth. The effects of sensitivity to light can be so severe that the sufferers lose their eyes and the ears, basically turning them into what the vampire looked like in the movie Nosferatu. Vampires were associated with Transylvania, a historic region in Romania, in large part because they were fictional. And this is where we kind of get into the split between like the old folklore and the new. In Romania, fears of the strigoi, once human monsters who need blood to survive, had circulated for hundreds of years. In fact, there is a vampire slaying ritual in a Romanian village performed after deceased laborer Petra Toma family decided that he'd become a strigoi and he came back from life. Guys, this was in 2003, so not that long ago, 20 years ago. 6 men exhumed his body, staked it, sprinkled it with garlic, and opened Toma's ribcage with a pitchfork. They took out his heart, burnt it, and drank the ashes in a glass of water. That seems like a little severe, but, whatever. In Bulgaria, a 700-year-old skeleton discovered in 2012 points to the region's own vampire-slaying customs. Pinned down with a rock to keep the dead from rising, it had also been stabbed through the chest with an iron rod, and its teeth had been removed. Meanwhile, in a mass grave in the 16th century of plague victims, unearthed by archaeologists in Italy in 2006, a brick was wedged into one female skeleton's jaw, an exorcism technique used on suspected vampires in Europe at the time. All of these stories drew inspiration from Eastern and Central European folklore. Dracula, perhaps one of the most of all, again, as Bram Stoker researched Transylvanian culture, he used a lot of that lore to write it. Count Dracula is widely believed to be inspired in part by the real Vlad Dracul, popularly known as Vlad the Impaler. In 15th century Romanian warrior prince, Vlad is infamous for his barbaric torture methods on the battlefield. As the name suggests, he'd impale foes on his stakes and leave them to bleed out by the thousands. It's been over 100 years since the first vampire story craze of the 1800s, and the myths have been taken in every direction unimaginable. What is a vampire? A vampire is a mythical creature that subsists by feeding on the vital essences of the living. In European folklore, vampires are undead creatures that often visit loved ones and cause mischief or deaths in the neighborhood they inhabited while they were alive. They wore shrouds and were often described as bloated and of ruddy or dark countenance, markedly different from today's pale, gaunt vampires which date from the early 19th century. Vampiric entities have been recorded in cultures around the world. The term vampire was popularized in Western Europe after reports of the 18th century of mass hysteria. In modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity, although the belief in similar vampiric creatures still persists in some cultures. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. The story was highly successful and arguably the most influential vampire work of the 19th century. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis of modern vampire legend, even though it was published after fellow Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel Carmilla. The success of the book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century, with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. Now, you may think that there's only one type of vampire, the ones that go around and capture people, drink blood, villains, but I will let you know that allegedly there's multiple types. So, the first we're going to cover is the blood drinker, also known as the sanguine vampire. This vampire category is what comes to mind when most people think of the word vampire. The blood-drinking vampire can be found in all cultures across the world and dates back all the way to the mythology of ancient Greece. Blood-drinking vampire must consume blood in order to survive and can be seen hunting humans to get its blood food source. Resources of vampiric lore say that one feeding of human blood can allow the vampire to last up to 2 weeks, but it in that 2 weeks without harming the overall health and function of the vampire. 2 weeks would be a survivor's diet. Therefore, we see most vampires feeding at far too frequent intervals. Emphatic vampires are closely related to elemental vampires. The emphatic vampire does not feed on human blood to sustain itself. In fact, the emphatic vampire can feed on emotions and feelings of the host human, ranging from love to angst and every emotion in between. In contrast, the elemental vampire does not feed on human blood, but also does not feed on human emotions or energy. The elemental vampire feeds off the natural energy source like lightning and wind. Disfigured vampires, also known as Nosferatu. Disfigured vampires possess abnormal physical characteristics and at times a bit grotesque. This disfigurement was either a result of a very long vampire life or lack of care, or a complication at the time of vampiric transformation. Genetic vampires are most commonly seen in the sci-fi paranormal genre. There's two main categories. 1, vampire that is created in a lab by science. 2, vampires that are created from the mating of one vampire parent and one human parent. They liken this to the creation of the demigods of mythology. Now, genetic vampires will exhibit some vampiric traits and abilities, but not all. Insane vampires, as the name implies, these are the most common vampires who were once human and now cannot handle the transformation. Insane vampires are erratic, hard to control, and most of the times dangerous as all. Psi vampires. A more modern-day vampire. This creature does not suck blood, but rather extracts life energy from the host or even a crowd of people in order to sustain themselves. Psi vampires, unlike blood-sucking vampires, do not kill the host human. Rather, the host human may experience drowsiness, fatigue, or exhaustion. Sexual vampires. The most famous of all the sexual vampires are the succubus, female, and the incubus, the male, and they feed off the sexual energy of their host human. While the sexual vampire can consume sexual energy just from the act of sexual contact, most sexual vampires prefer to extract the full sexual energy or the orgasmic energy of the host human at climax. Soul vampires. The name is fairly self-explanatory. Soul vampires feed off the soul energy of the host human. By feeding off the soul energy of the host human, the host has a shortened lifespan, and as a consequence, in addition, it is not uncommon to see a soul vampire unintentionally kill the host human by feeding too often on the soul energy of the host. Again, I just barely scratched the surface of what these things are, so please, be careful out there, because you never know what's gonna try to get you.
Happy Halloween, everybody.